All right, it is 1:40, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to this edition of the Friday ITS seminar. And hello, everyone. This is the first time we're meeting in person this quarter. I'm the instructor of record. If you have issues, you come talk to me. Make sure to sign the attendance sheet that's going around, and things will operate as they have for many quarters before. I am pleased this week to do something a little bit different. We're kind of playing with some formats with the ITS seminar this quarter. And, one of the things that we don't do in TTP for our PhD students is require them to give a dissertation defense. They can write their dissertation, get some signatures, and be on their way, which is great for them in terms of streamlining their degree, but is terrible for us because we don't get a public forum for them to share their research with us. So I'm hoping this will inspire a little bit more of public sharing of research, because I have 3 recent TTP Ph.D. alums who are going to share their dissertation research with us today. We'll start with Kelly Hoogland, who was a graduate student researcher at the Electric Vehicle Research Center, and her research focuses on consumer side mechanisms shaping electric vehicle adoption, with an emphasis on charging infrastructure, financial incentives, leasing, and equity-focused policy in California. We'll move to Weijing Wang, who's now a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley's Safe Track, where she researches the intersection of transportation, safety, and justice. And then finally joining us online, we'll have Rey Hosseinzade, who's an engineer and planner at Fair and Peers, who's passionate about building transportation systems that are data-driven, equitable, and grounded in real community needs. So each speaker will have about 20 minutes to talk, and we'll do a Q&A after each one, and that'll be our session today. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here and be able to talk to you all. So the focus of my dissertation is about charging infrastructure, incentives, and equity in electric vehicle adoption. And my committee members were Scott Hartman, Devipriya Chakraborty, David Bunch, and Jesus. So just for a quick motivation, to ground ourselves, electric vehicles represent about 6% of all registered vehicles in California. And the high upfront costs and charging access are some of the widely cited barriers to EV adoption. Yet these objective measures do not fully capture how consumers perceive these policies or infrastructure availability. And so this research aims to understand consumer purchase consideration of electric vehicles within this context. And we understand purchase consideration to be a process that starts with awareness and progressively includes more actions until ultimately adoption, where we expect to lose people along the way, but we need to maximize the number of people, communities, or households, or whatever scale we're thinking about entering the process in the first place. And so as an overview into the 3 main chapters, the first chapter focuses on public charging awareness, with the main research question asking whether or not non-electric vehicle owners notice public charging. And the framework we used for that comes from cognitive psychology, investigating what people notice in their environment and what drives them to notice it in the first place. And the data, as for all the chapters, comes from survey data, all cross-sectional, but sometimes for multiple years. And in this case, it's car-owning households in California. And the primary contribution here is really introducing awareness of public charging as the mechanism driving the relationship between infrastructure and sales. And then the next chapter looks at incentive reliance, with the main research question asking what the impact of the federal tax credit is on purchase and lease decisions. And here we use a discrete choice model to investigate that. And we use data from 2018 and 19 of electric vehicle owners. And so this is the only chapter where the data is actually EV owners primarily, or exclusively. And so the primary contribution here is that we actually specify separate models for purchasers versus people who lease their EV, or I'll refer to those as lessees. And also identify the characteristics associated with higher reliance on the federal tax credit. And then lastly, we're looking at targeted policy interventions with an equity perspective, looking at the effectiveness of existing targeted incentives. And here we're looking specifically at battery electric vehicles as it relates to how do these policies actually increase purchase consideration in their targeted communities. And here we're using survey data from collected in 2023 and 2024 of priority population households, and I'll get into that specific definition when the time comes. But first, let's just jump into chapter 2, which is called "If You Build It, Will They Notice?" And if you want to read more, you can reference the published version I have below. And so to get into this motivation, it is often claimed that building more public charging infrastructure will cause an increase in sales. But most studies which make this claim are actually based on correlations, not causes, in addition to aggregating charging density on a variety of scales with outliers identified at each one of these scales. And most importantly for this research motivation, they do not control for whether or not people see charging. And so, as I mentioned before, this is the mechanism we introduced to be the mediating variable between density, awareness, and purchase consideration. So we use a structural equation model framework to answer these questions with we have the full model with all of the modeled relationships, but here I just want to zoom in on the most important ones, being the relationship between public charging density and whether or not people see charging or report having seen charging. In addition to whether or not if people see charging, there's any relationship with their consideration to purchase an electric vehicle. And then lastly, whether or not density itself has any direct relationship with purchase consideration. And as you can see, we control for a variety of other variables related to consumer knowledge and awareness and consumer demographics and household characteristics. So what we found was no relationship between the density of public charging and whether or not respondents had reported seeing any charging or considered buying an EV. But rather, public charging awareness and purchase consideration were predicted by measures of prior engagement, in addition to access to home charging. And lastly, public charging awareness was correlated with having higher assessments of electric vehicle charging, in addition to overall mass marketability of EVs, which then had an indirect effect overall on purchase consideration. So to conclude, the main takeaway here was that building out more public charging infrastructure does not itself constitute an engagement strategy, but rather seeing chargers requires that consumers know what they look like and where to expect them and caring enough to notice in the first place. And so enhancing potential adopters' knowledge in the first place is an important supplement to leveraging these investments. So the next chapter is about the investigating the impact of the federal tax credit, looking at EV owners' retrospective decision in the absence of the tax credit. And again, if you want to read more, you can reference the published version of this research in Transportation Research Part A. So the background for this is really honing in on EV leasing specifically. And so leasing in general is important for the EV market when considering that they enter the used vehicle market much quicker than purchased vehicles. In addition to the fact that the federal tax credit is provided to lessees in the form of an upfront price reduction, whereas purchasers receive this credit when filing for taxes. So it's important to investigate the impact of the federal tax credit specifically for lessees. And so that's what this research aims to do, with it also identifying the household and vehicle characteristics associated with greater reliance on the tax credit. And so to do this, we had the survey of electric vehicle owners, and we asked them what their hypothetical adoption decision would have been in the absence of the tax credit. And you can see over on the left how this was asked within the survey, and over on the right, the various choice responses for purchasers and lessees. And so we can see that a much greater amount of purchasers would have decided to not change their adoption decision in the absence of the tax credit and would have chosen the same electric vehicle, whereas more lessees would have chosen either another electric vehicle, no vehicle at all, or a conventional gas car. And so, as I mentioned, we ran separate logistic regression models controlling for the tax credit they received as a share of the lease cost for lessees to capture the discount that they were receiving and what the impact of losing that discount would have been for their lease decision. And so I'll focus just on the results for lessees. And we can see in this figure showing on the y-axis their probability of choosing the various alternatives. And over on the x-axis, we have the discount percent ranging from about 10% to 60% of the lease cost. And as this increases, we see that in the absence of the tax credit, there's a large increase in the probability that they'll lease no vehicle at all or choose to lease a conventional vehicle, with the other alternatives of leasing an electric vehicle or choosing to purchase the electric vehicle decreasing. And so some other key variables which we found to be significantly associated with relying on the federal tax credit for the purchase decision included owning fewer vehicles in the household, having lack of access to home charging, and buying less expensive electric vehicles. So in conclusion, the federal tax credit encourages both purchasers and lessees to choose an electric vehicle, but due to lessees receiving this discount as an upfront price reduction, it could be more impactful for their decisions. And buyers of higher priced electric vehicles and longer range electric vehicles may be less reliant on the tax credit, and could also potentially compensate for the higher costs faced by those who do not have access to charging their EV at home. So the last chapter is focusing on policy interventions to increase electric vehicle consideration amongst priority populations. And these are communities which are defined by legislation as being tribal or disadvantaged, which is based on Callen-Byros screen score of economic and pollution burden, as well as those who meet average low income thresholds. And we can see compared to the non-priority, aka every other census tract that isn't one of these, that they have a much larger share of electric vehicles. And so while there are a variety of targeted interventions within California to increase electric vehicle adoption within these communities, no prior study has really investigated the extent to which they actually have an impact on their targeted communities. And so we designed a survey to try to answer this question. based on barriers that we identified through listening session, based on high purchase price, lack of access to charging, as well as battery-related concerns. And so we transformed these barriers, for each of these barriers, we have a associated policy interventions with various levels based on actual California policy for each of the related categories, being financial incentives, charging access, and battery assurance measures. And so here is an example of what respondents could have seen when taking the survey, where they were given this scenario of having various policy interventions related to the categories, and then at the end were asked their consideration to buy an EV. And the main takeaway of what we found here is that over on the left, we have the Clean Cars for All, and that is a large financial incentive, and we see that compared to having no information on this incentive, it does significantly increase purchase consideration. And then in the middle, we have various levels of access to charging, where we see that compared to public level 2 charging, we actually do not see public fast charging having an increase in purchase consideration. But the destinations which do have a relative increase in purchase consideration compared to public level 2 include home, destination, or a combination of those locations. And then we did not find anything significant with the battery assurance measures. And then we also found some other variables which were associated with higher purchase consideration, mostly focusing on having positive perceptions of various attributes related to battery quality, charging, and home chargeability. So the main conclusions here are that fast charging was not found to be an equitable substitute for home charge access as it relates to the locations which really drive these communities' consideration to buy an electric vehicle. And an important note was that the presence of the policy interventions themselves accounted for a small amount of the variation in EV purchase consideration. And we overall found that the policy interventions alone accounted for just a small share, but it was more significantly determined by things like income, people who buy new cars, having positive perceptions of EV attributes, as well as some attitudinal variables. So just to conclude, I'm also ending it with the purchase consideration as a funnel to really drive home the point that incentives and infrastructure can only shape demand if consumers are aware of them. And so they cannot just exist, they need to be actually driving consumers to taking more action. And targeted outreach and expanded home charge access are critical for households and communities which are not currently engaged with the EV transition. And so with that, that's all I have, and thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah.
I was just curious about your, well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It's really good. And I was curious about sort of your final conclusion from the third chapter around the charging elements for home charging, especially for disadvantaged communities. Like, if you were to take policy recommendations from your research, I was just curious if you could sort of expound upon like where might be the greatest avenues for sort of getting that charging connected with the purchase of the vehicle. Like, should it be bundled in with additional credits? Or let's say I'm a low income person who lives in like an apartment complex or someplace where I don't control my infrastructure. Like, did you have any thoughts around like how state government or some sort of agency could sort of activate more charging opportunities in those spaces to sort of help drive EV adoption in those communities?
Yeah, it's definitely tricky because within the charging infrastructure landscape, there's a lot of different stakeholders, and I think the government actually, you know, in terms of CARB, CEC, they actually don't have much influence over a lot of the ways that the needle can be moved in that way, because a lot of it does come down to city level governance and you know, city codes and things like that. So I think from a government agency perspective, that's why they've been focusing on reliability of fast charging in particular, is that's the avenue that they have for expanding access, which doesn't necessarily you know, touch, you know, home charge access specifically, but does, you know, is sort of offered as, it's often assumed, well, people in apartments will need public charging, yeah. But they recognize that that's actually hasn't been effectively increasing adoption in communities where fast charging is being installed. So yeah, I think it does come down to identifying regions where apartment owners are more amenable. It does, yeah, I mentioned it's at like the local level, but also within like individual apartments. Yeah, because getting down to the decision makers at that level, I think, is sort of necessary. And yeah, I think a lot of people are doing that work, but it's definitely where like providing technical assistance and all of these things and aligning motivations is the technical challenge. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Other questions for Kelly?
So I see that one big takeaway from presentation is that the access to home charger really correlates to decision to purchase at least. So what do you mean with the access to home charger? Is that the person have home charger at their home, or does it also include like public charging in their apartment complex? Does it also count as charging?
So yeah, that's a good question. That's good. So most of the time in the surveys, it's asked as having electricity access where they park at their residential location. So not necessarily having a dedicated, you know, charging equipment, but having just the voltage, which yeah, a 220 volt, yeah, or 120, or yeah, whatever. Sorry, the voltage I may have messed up. But yeah, having either level 1 or level 2 electricity access where they park. And the other thing is that can be measured. That's like an objective measure, but we also asked people about their subjective experience, like asking whether or not they think they could plug in at home. And so that was a variable in the first and third chapter, and both of those were significant as well. But those two variables are correlated, but not exactly, because there's definitely people in households who do have home charging, but it's a knowledge gap of not necessarily being aware that they have that access. And I think that's actually the households that in terms of like utility-led programs, those are sort of the target, because they're sort of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of getting them to have access or adopt. Yeah.
I think this was from your first chapter about the EV tax credit. But were you able to determine if the number of cars per household increased from the tax credit, or even the amount that people drive per household from the tax credit?
Oh, whether or not like, wait, sorry, did you say something like that?
Yeah. I think you had a graph where you showed that people may not purchase a vehicle if they didn't have the tax credit. So I was wondering if you could see like how many cars were owned per household prior to the tax credit, and then with the tax credit being implemented, if households bought more cars?
Right, so we did find that households with more cars were less reliant on the tax credit, whereas those with fewer vehicles were actually more. And I think that could track with just new car buyers in general having more cars and buying more cars, and if they were less maybe they're not necessarily driving more, but just owning more cars. Yeah.
You mentioned that your survey was cross-sectional, right?
Mhm.
Are there any aspects of it that if you were to think about a longitudinal survey, are there any gaps that you've seen with this study that you think you'd want to look into more panel study in future?
Yeah, for all of them, I would say. Yeah. Panel data would definitely be sort of the
I asked
gold standard.
specifically as far as, because the big thing coming out of this is accessibility, and especially as far as awareness to the technology goes. So with technology acceptance models, there's perceived ease of use, and so I'm wondering how that will look like for the households who currently are considered to be disadvantaged, and whether they perceive the new technology to be easier to adopt down the road.
Yeah, having the time element definitely is important, or adds a lot of value, I should say. Yeah, for all of these studies, we're just comparing within survey respondents, at the same time. Not, resampling to see if there's an increase over time based on, an increase in perceived ease of use. And same thing with the charging awareness, we're not looking at whether or not people are more aware over time within, the same zip code, for example, if there was an increase over time in public charging, if they're becoming more aware, but more so within different zip codes, just comparing people's awareness. So yeah, having panel data in general allows for a lot more rich takeaways, I would say, but you work with what you have.
All right, we'll leave it at that. If there's more questions, maybe Kelly can stick around for a few minutes at the end. So thank you. Great. Next up is Weijing.
Hi everyone, thanks sisters. So today's talk, I'm going to talk a small piece of my dissertation and research in general. Just a thank you notes to my committee, Jesus, Susan Handy, and Carrie Watkins. Real quick. So as many of us know, traffic fatalities has become an issue that concerns many of us. Just a few numbers: in the US, a total of 43,000 people are killed in a car crash every year. With this urgency, the US DOT adopted a 2022 National Roadway Safety Strategy, which officially introduced the Safe System Approach policy to transportation safety in the US. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the policy, the Safe System Approach represents a holistic vision to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries. It comes along with a few core principles. Here, human make mistakes and errors. Human are vulnerable to injury. Responsibility is shared. No deaths of serious injury is acceptable. And lastly, we adopt proactive measures relative to reactive ones. The policy comes along with 5 elements, which are widely known to researchers and practitioners: safe people, roads, vehicles, and speed, and lastly, post-crash care. So different from the safe system approach, here is our conventional framework. So under this framework, we are trying to model crash frequency, crash rate, and crash injury severity based on a series of predictor variables like socioeconomic factors, human behaviors, road infrastructure, as well as living environment. So under this framework, human behavior is modeled as a predictor and contributing factor to crash outcomes. Because of this type of research, research of this type leads to a number of interventions that target changes of human behaviors, for example, speeding or traveling under the influence. Sorry. So over time, we observe some inequitable outcomes. For example, under the police strategy, we say racially biased policing, crash victims being blamed for their harms, and in some cases, lack of safer infrastructure in underserved communities. To address this disparity and inequities, a couple of years ago, California adopted this policy interventions initiative to integrate the safe system approach and equity principles into California's strategic highway safety plan. So because these equity elements, my research here is looking at the safe system approach from a justice perspective. Those are three leading justice frameworks: distributive procedure, as well as restorative justice. If we're thinking about the principles of safe system approach from justice framework, we are looking at the safe system approach trying to shift the safety responsibilities from the humans to the safe system to the system, and acknowledging human errors. So we are trying to balance and to do the equitable distribution of resources. And lastly, we're trying to uncover and repair historical harms and ensure equitable outcomes. So I continue here by acknowledging human error and limitations. The safe system approach will define transportation safety as a justice movement toward more equitable outcomes. So here, I have just three research questions. What are the characteristics of human errors in fatal serious crashes that disproportionately affect marginalized groups? And what are the factors associated? Where do those errors occur, and what are the place characteristics of those locations? And how do systemic constraints such as demographic disadvantages and infrastructure constraints influence the observed pattern of human behaviors? So the main data source come from three databases: transportation injury mapping system developed by UC Berkeley SafeTrack, OpenStreetMap, as well as American Community Survey. I conducted a study for the state of California. The dependent variable here is the error type, which is the different type of human behaviors that contributes to a fatal or serious crashes. I used a number of predictor variables, for example, road classification, person characteristics, mode of travel, crash place characteristics, rural and non-rural location, as well as population size. Sorry, the technical. So I used two approaches: discrete statistical analysis as well as multinomial logistic regression. The first approach is used to identify the characteristic of human errors that disproportionately affect marginalized groups, and identifying the person and place characteristic of those affected. Multinomial logistic regression is used to estimating the odds of being fatally or seriously injured in crashes linked to specific error types based on series of predictor variables. So here are some findings highlighted here. Of all fatal and serious crashes included in the analysis, 8 different error types are identified. The figure here is we are looking at the distribution of fatal service crashes by different error types. So from the top to the bottom, the first one is under the influence, which accounts for 18% of all fatal serious crashes. There's a few other error types like unsafe speed, improper turning, and then pedestrian-related reasons accounts for 15% of all crashes. So if we look at the social demographic factors here, overall, women account for 30% of all fatal serious crash injuries, despite making up half of the population. But when we examining the specific error types, women are disproportionately affected by crashes involving pedestrian-related reasons or traffic signal or sign violations. There's also some patterns when we look at the racial and ethnicity variables. Black travelers are injured in pedestrian-related crashes at 1.4 times the rate of their overall injury. Hispanic travelers are injured in crashes involving traveling under the influence at 1.2 times the rate of their overall injury share. Vulnerable road users. Cyclists are injured in crashes involving traveling on the wrong side of the road, violating traffic signal signs, or drivers violating the right of way at about 1.7 to 2.8 times the rate of their overall injury share. Passengers are injured in crashes involving traveling under the influence at 1.6 times the rate of their overall injury share. So I also look at how the place characters looks like by error type. Here are some main findings. The same errors are also concentrated in underserved community, which are characterized by a higher share of people of color, non-citizens, foreign-born residents, as well as college households. So for example, if you look at it here, there's a difference of 10 percentage points between those who are those crashes related to pedestrian reasons as well and the overall injury. And here also those error types concentrated in low-income communities. If you compare the median household income of those overall injury with crashes linked to pedestrian-related reason, there is a difference up to nearly $7,000. Here I'm presenting some findings in terms of associated factors of error types. One thing is fatal and serious crashes linked to traveling under the influence have 18% to 39% higher odds of involving Hispanic travelers when compared to white travelers. Mode of travel is also an associated factor. Fatal and serious injuries linked to wrong-way traveling have 5 times the odds of involving cyclists relative to drivers. And fatal and serious crashes linked to traffic signal and sign violation have twice the odds of involving pedestrians compared to drivers. So here are some implications. So the first thing I want to highlight is not all human errors are the same in fatal and serious crashes. So disparities are notable. Social demographic characteristics are associated with error types, and mode of travel is another associated factor. Also, certain error types affect marginalized groups to a much larger degree than others. Here are some characteristics of those error types. For example, pedestrian-related reasons and traffic signal or sign violations affecting women, Black travelers, underserved communities to a larger degree. And traveling under the influence is an error type that affects Hispanic travelers to a larger degree than white travelers. So here's some future research. The first thing I learned from my research is we need do some further research to define error that is separated from violations. Which is important because in the current model, we are modeling human behavior as a driver of fatal and serious injuries. In a safe system approach framework, we are thinking about like what are the underlying cause of those human behavior. But human behavior are categorized in different groups like errors or violations, which have different associated factors. So here I want to highlight, we do want to address the underlying or systemic cause of human errors if those are errors relative to violations, particularly those affecting marginalized groups or injuries experienced by marginalized groups. And lastly, there's comes to the data limitation. Like we ask a question, who make those errors in a traffic crash? There's a potential accountability in that process. It could be crash victims or the other party actually injured like another crash victim in that process, which we don't really know given the data we have access to. But those like answers to those questions will lead to very different intervention strategies. So of course, we expect that to be more effective or efficient. Without that, thank you.
Great, thank you. Questions for Weijing?
Yes.
Yes, so what are considered as like the cause of pedestrian related reasons? So that does it include signal violations by pedestrians or just errors? Or like what does it mean by like errors made by pedestrians?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not addressed in this research here. To your question, like the data collected by the police and reported to Cal DOT, like in the report, this category is defined as two groups, I would say. Like one is automobile violating the right of way of a pedestrian. The other one is pedestrian violating the right of way of a car, like a driver. So those two very different. If we say like these two categories have very different reasons of how that happens, so we don't. I mean, I guess that's the definition on the book, like in the data records. So we don't know if we have like even more detailed level of description other than those two broad categories. That's a very good question. I think some of our research partner with Safe Track right now, we are trying to figure out like pedestrian crashes, like fatal and severe crashes at intersections, like how the interaction between driver and pedestrian affect the reasons of behavior and the outcome of that behavior. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I know that after transportation crashes are really underreported and the reports we get aren't usually super detailed. And so I'm curious kind of, with your work with SafeTrack, and honestly, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about what SafeTrack does too, and the data you were pulling from, and I guess what you would like to see if you could improve the data, kind of make one or two changes to crash reporting data for active transportation. What do you think would make a big impact? A little bit like there were three questions in one.
That's
I'm sorry.
A great question. So what do I want to do to improve the data quality? I have to say, with the data we have access to, like there's currently, I'm aware there's two approaches. One is publicly accessible database, which like everybody can download and analyze. The other one is we have to request and put into those applications and ask for it. SafeTrack does have that. Like we are able to apply for the access to those more detailed level of crash data. As a researcher, I would say, like as I said in the slides of future research, because I'm very interested in like how like the core principle of safe system approach is to eventually we build an environment like people are like people can make mistakes, but they won't be killed or seriously injured in any matter. Which means like we need to understand their people's behavior and the system, how those interact. Like even though we adopt those technology like autonomous vehicle, which still very big part, like the interaction between human and the system. So I would very much want to know, like in the crash data, when the crash occurred, resulting in a fatality or serious injury, like who actually made that error? Oh, that error, even not an error, is a violation of traffic regulations, which I don't know right now. So the data I used was public accessible database, which it doesn't give us that information. But I'm trying there's two ways to do it. Like one is public agency overhaul their database and start collecting those attributes. But the other way is we do the experimental studies and to observe the interaction at like certain locations and analyze that pattern. Yeah, but it's a long answer to your question. Thank you for the question. Happy to talk about what's happening in SafeTrack.
Any other questions for Weijing? All right, thank you. All right, and last but certainly not least, Rey, you're up.
Yes. Let me just try to share my screen. Okay, there you go. Perfect. Cool. Hi everyone. I am really happy to be here. I remember sitting on those chairs and listening to all these amazing presentations, and I really hope that you have the same feeling in that room today. And I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person. Today, I want to talk about policy evaluation, which I worked on for my dissertation. And before I get into the nitty-gritty details of that, I want to talk a little bit about why I got into policy evaluation field. Ever since I started school, even as a child, I was really impressed and impacted by policies that were implemented around my life. So I realized it and internalized the impact of policies, a wide range of policies on humans' lives, day-to-day life. So as soon as I got into my undergrad, I started writing in a new local newspaper, explaining all this urban policies, transportation policies to people from like all sorts of backgrounds. When I moved to the United States, I started working as a transit planner at VTA, and during the first few months of my job, VTA went through a major change in service, and I experienced the impact that change and the policies that led to that change on people's movements and mobility, at least. So when I started my PhD, I showed interest in policy evaluation, and I was really lucky to have a wonderful committee, Dr. Susan Handy as my chair, Dr. Jesus Barajas, and then Dr. Jamie Walker. And then I started working on a specific 743 implementation, which is a relatively new policy in SQL world. So that inspired me to continue working on it. And I explained what it is, what it entails in quite a bit. So what does this mean? CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, is kind of NEPA's baby in California, enacted in 1970s to protect the environment. And basically, it asks for disclosure and mitigation of any negative impact that new developments could have on environment. It includes a wide range of topics from pollution, air pollution, water, culture, urban planning. I believe it's more than like there are more than 20 subjects, one of which is transportation impact, and that's the subject that we are talking about today. So, if a project goes through CEQA and it has significant impact, they have to go through this very lengthy process to provide EIR, environmental impact report, and disclose all those impacts. For the transportation impact chapter, historically, level of service had been used. And in 2013, the state changed that metric to VMT, vehicle mile traveled, as a metric to assess the transportation impact of development projects. And even though it was enacted in 2013, it wasn't required and enforced until July 2020. So it's relatively new. And it aimed to streamline the CEQA, reduce and align with the goal of reducing GHG emissions and promoting infill and sustainable transportation. So, to give you a little bit of background about like the process and how it works, and this is important to understand the rest of this presentation, it's that when a project comes in and it's subject to CEQA, it has to go through a preset screening criteria. So the screening criteria usually are like, is this a small project? Does it make a significant impact in terms of like its size? Is it affordable housing? Because affordable, we want to promote some type of projects and we include them in a screening criteria. So the project doesn't have to go through the lengthy process of EIR. And then, of course, if it's not meeting any of those criteria, it will be compared to a threshold. In all those fields of air pollution, water, and transportation, there is a metric, like right now it's VMT, and there is a threshold, acceptable threshold, or threshold of significance, if you want to speak the technical term, threshold of significance. And then if, as you see here on the right side of the slide, if the project generates any amount less than threshold, then it doesn't have to go through the EIR. And if it does, in fact, it has to mitigate its impact, or the projects with significant impacts can also use this a statement of overriding consideration, which is basically meaning, hey, we know this project has a significant impact on whatever field, but we want it, we want to go with it, we want to move forward with it, we are going to accept this negative impact. And there is one really important factor here that I want you to pay attention to. This is a law. So all the jurisdictions in California, 539 of them, have to abide by this. So meaning that they have to use VMT in their CEQA analysis, but the VMT threshold that is being used in transportation impact analysis, how it's set, or even adopting a VMT threshold, it's not mandatory. So the state has left it to each agency's discretion to set their own VMT threshold. And why it matters is, first of all, the stricter you are with your VMT threshold, it means more projects will have to go through an EIR. But at the same time, which is, you can say it can be perceived as a negative side effect. But if you're en route to reduce your VMT, you have to have a more stringent threshold, meaning lowering your VMT levels. And as a part of my dissertation and a research project that I had worked on, we reviewed all the jurisdictions' implementation guidelines, and there is a wide range of VMT threshold adoption. Some didn't even adopt one. So they went with, oh, we are going to review each project on a case by case basis and then evaluate that. So it kind of implies how rigor an agency is to reduce their VMT. So with keeping that in mind, I wanted to know what influenced all these agencies to adopt all these different thresholds. And then there are three types of thresholds. If they, first of all, no threshold, meaning case by case basis. And then the second type is status quo, meaning anything below existing level is acceptable. And the third one is the strictest one, and I talk about this. It's like, oh, we don't want to keep on existing level. We want to even reduce our existing level to a lower level, and that's called percent reduction from baseline. And I wanted to know why all these jurisdictions went each way. And then when they selected a percent reduction below the baseline, what was their influential impacts? What influenced them to go the most strict route? And then for my last chapter, I wanted to know, okay, kind of like a post-processing check. Has it changed anything on the ground? Are we seeing any changes in the attributes of the projects that are being proposed and built, the location of them, and the mitigation that they are undertaking? So these are the main overall questions that I had. So it's kind of influenced and inspired by policy driving factors, and then the changes that we see, the ultimate goal that this policy is aiming is VMT GHG emission reduction, right? So how it can be done is, okay, you have these factors that influence the policy. The policy impacts land use and transportation and network, basically. And then that changing network, hopefully for the better or worse, will impact and influence travel behavior. So going back to the threshold, and this is because this is the core of my my dissertation, I have to talk about it again. So we have three types of adoption, and the lower you go, it's more stringent, and it means if you go the lower and like have a wider gap between existing VMT level and VMT thresholds, it means that more projects need an EIR. And then we have jurisdictions that had adopted an existing level VMT, and they spoke about that, and we have this most strict threshold. So my first chapter looked at the option whether to adopt or not adopt a VMT threshold, and whether they went with an status quo, or for the ones who did indeed adopt a VMT threshold, did they go with the status quo option or actual like a meaningful reduction from existing levels? There is this work is supported by more theory, and the more theory says that the environmental policies, the stringency in environmental policies is influenced by three main categories: motivation, resources, and obstacles. And when we kind of relax the constraints and obstacles, the agencies will tend to adopt a stricter policies and implement it actually. So down the literature review path, I try to find any and every factors that might influence policy adoption and categorize them within these categories: technical knowledge, population, budget, how wealthy is an organization, and so social demographics of the population there. It's kind of like resources, obstacles, costs, obviously, reducing VMT, reducing driving. Um, it's a very hard thing. And when there is a higher level of VMT, it's even harder to get that down. And the motivation is like the supports that they had, like OPR, now renamed to LCI, um, provided a guideline. Because this is a new topic, all the transportation engineers and traffic engineers were familiar with level of service, and the technical advisory meant to help them hit the ground and analyze their projects with VMT now. So all these factors were categorized, and then I use a survey in addition to the information that I previously gathered for a research project. I sent the survey to 539 jurisdictions one by one. And for this chapter, I have a binary variable dependent variable of identification of adoption versus not adoption. So out of that emails, the 3-4 months of emails, I got 246 responses, out of which only almost half was complete enough for me to use in the analysis. So a short review of the responses. As you can see, the jurisdictions that had more population, but with less revenue and budget, they tend to respond more. I had more of those jurisdictions in my responses. And yeah, and the majority of them were city clerks and planners who responded to my requests, and directors, managers as well. Okay, so I ran a binomial logic model, and you can see a descriptive analysis shows that it kind of checks some of those hypotheses that jurisdictions with higher median income and higher average population tend to go on kind of a stricter option and adopt a threshold rather than going on a case-by-case basis. Also, if the interesting part was the jurisdictions that had adopted a threshold had significantly lower existing VMT levels. And I obtained the existing VMTs from the VMT Plus tool. The graph on the left shows the significancy levels of all those independent variables. You can see that staff advocacy, political ideology of planning staff, and as well as the existence of OPR/LCI, technical advisory, as well as the population were very significant and positively impacting the adoption of a threshold. And then the next question was for what they did adopt and how those factors influenced the decision. The trend remained here. As you can see, the jurisdictions with a lower household median income and higher existing VMT for both employee and home-based VMT tend to adopt the status quo, or like anything below existing levels is acceptable to us. Same here. Advocacy and having an advocate among staff and management, and the liberal political view by planning, staff, and management was really significant, as well as if there is another or other VMT reduction policies, whether they have like a climate action plan that aims to reduce VMT. So, how much and how far they can go for the jurisdictions that they did adopt the strictest option, meaning a reduction below baseline. And this part was a little bit tricky for us because we wanted to have an apple-to-apple comparison. But then, yes, you can see the distribution of the percentage, the numeric percentage is kind of consistent, but then the baseline varies. Some jurisdictions use baseline VMTs as their baseline for 15% below, whereas you can see that they use CAS levels, they use county levels, they use built up general plans and regions and unincorporated counties. So there's a wide range of the baselines. So we wanted to have consistent comparison for the model. So what I did was basically calculated the reduction value of VMT to be able to compare it. So basically we had the numeric 15%, 10%, whatever, 18%. We had even some jurisdictions that went above 15% reduction and they went to 18% reduction. And then the value of that existing baseline. And then calculated the VMT per capita or VMT per unit as the dependent variable. And I ran the linear regression model for office and residential VMT thresholds. There was wide range of VMT reduction. You can see on the lower left graph. And the model results showed a kind of balance between significant and insignificant variables here for the residential model. But for the office, you can see the number of variables that I could find significant in my model lowered, and we had to figure out why. And one of the reasons that we were pointed to was the development office and basically employment-based developments are more dependent on market values and market trends. So the market forces are much stronger than any other factors that I could find that would influence policy adoption. So for the third chapter, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to see what actual changes this policy is making on the ground. So has the proportion of projects with potentially significant transportation impact changed? Are they now proposed in specific regions? And what attributes they have? And so this is the conceptual model for this part of the dissertation, which is basically SP7 for the SP743 implementation impacts the geographic distribution and project characteristics and mitigation measures. But there are also moderating factors here that are greater than just one policy. Selected San Jose and as a case study for this to kind of conduct a before and after SP743 implementation analysis. And before I get into why San Jose, I should mention the ways that SB 743 could influence land use development are two ways. Remember, screening criteria. So some projects can utilize those screening criteria, for example, including affordable housing or increasing density to lower their impact, even like essentially, and be eligible for that screening criteria. Or if they have significant impact, they have to, by law, mitigate it. And these mitigations, some of them are related to the project, like including bike lockers, adding and offering transit passes, the TDM measures that can eventually lead to lower VMT and bring the project's VMT generation to lower than significant levels. So these are the two ways that this could actually change the attributes of projects. And yeah, you can see the use of this screening criteria that the wide variety of them, and like how the cities are utilizing the screening criteria in their analysis. So why San Jose for this case? San Jose has been an early adopter of SB 743. It wasn't the policy wasn't mandated or enforced before July 2020, but San Jose has adopted it in 2018. They have relatively good access to high quality transit network. They have a very pro-density, pro-mixed-use general plan. They have defined growth areas within their general plan that focuses on improving job housing balance and transit accessibility and all this VMT reducing measures. And they do have a citywide TDM programs. They passed less than 2 years ago, they passed an ordinance to exempt infill housing. Infill housing is from this processes and whatnot, and they have a really rich in terms of pro VMT reduction housing elements. So I conducted a review of all the projects that were approved by the city in 2017 as a pre SB 743 era and 2023 as a post. And let me show you the maps. I'm almost running out of the time. So you can see the red dots, red homes that are showing the residential projects in 2017, and the blue ones are 2023. And you can, like, with just looking at the left map, you can ask, oh, why the projects after SB 743 are more widespread. And then when we add the layer of the growth areas, you can see now that somehow SB 743 is utilizing the growth areas more. And if you add even the layer of VMT thresholds and TPAs, which is transit priority areas, you can see that the spread projects after SB 743 actually are located within the low VMT areas or TPAs. And that kind of, I did actually interview the city officials, city planners from the San Jose, and that was actually one of the goals of the city to promote the low VMT areas, development in those areas, not only in downtown, but wherever in the city that is eligible for to be considered as a low VMT area. They wanted to utilize that and increase density there. So what I saw in after 2 years working on this was a fragmented adoption of VMT threshold, and the question that's left is this flexibility beneficial for tailoring the policy implementation to local needs, or do we need a more unified approach in order to reach the environmental goals that the city has? And then there are a variety of variables that could impact stringency in VMT threshold adoption in office and residential projects. And the follow-up question that can be studied is what can we do about those? And can we provide technical and financial support, or is there any mechanism that we can apply to the whole state to kind of bridge the gap between SB 743 intent and what's actually on the ground? And then San Jose has been a really good model for having kind of interdepartmental coalition between urban planning and transportation planning to kind of design these urban growth areas in align with TPAs and low VMT areas to kind of boost VMT reduction and development at the same time. So do we need a governance reform, or is this something that we can use in other jurisdictions to use those benefits as well? So with that, thank you so much. Let's get connected on LinkedIn. Shoot me your emails if you need more questions beyond what I can answer here. But I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you, Ray.
Of course. Thank you.
We have time for one medium-length question or a couple short questions. So, questions for Ray?
Yes, I have
Yeah.
one. So I was wondering if you had any kind of background knowledge about why it was adopted in this flexible way versus in a more standardized way, like were there LOS holdouts, or do you know what was going on?
It's the same style as level of service. Level of service was mandated to be used for the VMT assessment, for the transportation impact assessment, but the level that they had to comply with was left to jurisdiction's discretion. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, but why was there the flexibility in what the threshold was?
Oh, that's a good question. It's the state decision, and even with keeping it discretionary, there's a lot of pushback. I know there is a few working groups to even like overthrow this bill and go back to level of service. So my guess, my educated guess, is that the state is doing kind of inter-steps implementation. So for now, there is no level of mandated reduction. Maybe after a few years, they'll reassess that, like the VMT mitigation bank that the state is now developing as a statewide VMT mitigation form, and it's not mandatory to be used. So it's more political, I think, beyond my my level. I think that I couldn't find any rationale or reportable rationale for this question.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any last question for Ray as we close out? All right, well, thank you again to our
Thank you.
speakers. And that's all we have for today. So yeah, let's give everyone a